You're watching Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonprofit public affairs network, engaging the citizens of Wisconsin since 2007 through access to government proceedings and public policy events.
While we're getting mic'd up, let me introduce our panelists for this part of the program, entitled The Return on Investment and the Importance of Sustainability. We have with us Mr. Jim Wood, Strategic Counsel for Competitive Wisconsin and Chairman of Wood Communications Group. Mr. Darren Bulow from the worldwide consulting entity Deloitte. We have Professor Taggart Brooks, Dean of the College of Business Administration at the Harvard of the Midwest, and Ann Hlavaca, the Director of Small Business Development, also at the Harvard of the Midwest, University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. All right, lady and gentlemen, return on investment and sustainability, the importance of sustainability. Jim, you've done a lot of work in this, in modeling how we might create a sustainable model or get or capture the investment we must put in if we're going to try to address this issue. You want to walk through what you have to offer?
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. It's a delight to be here. As Marcus said, congratulations for all the good work you're doing. We find ourselves, I think, at a fascinating and important point in time. As I've listened to the discussion, a couple of the wrap-up points that I'm going to want to talk about at the end of the day today is, I think, from my vantage point, it's not either or. We need to be careful about saying you got to do this or that. It is a matter of saying how and when. Okay? We're at the front end of what is probably going to be a 2 to 5 year operation in terms of getting from where we are to where you folks would like to be. We are at a moment of great opportunity because the country, the communities, the employers are waking up to the need. The reality is they can't afford not to address this issue. They just haven't organized around how to go about doing that. I'm going to move through this very rapidly. We are videotaping all of this stuff. You can go look at it, and I'm happy to come anywhere and deliver it in great detail. But let me whip through it. As you know, Competitive Wisconsin believes that understanding the context in which decisions are made is a critical step in the process. As a backdrop for this discussion, therefore, it's worth noting that the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis reports that Wisconsin's economic growth was amongst the slowest in the nation last year, placing in the lowest ranking 6 states in the Union. Most employers and economists would agree, we believe, that these grim numbers are the result of an historic shortage of workers, and that the workforce shortages not only make it difficult to grow the economy, but also inhibit our ability to pay for critical public services and cripple our ability to build the better future we all want. Competitive Wisconsin believes that Wisconsin can address its workforce and general population shortages, but only if we recognize the need to recruit people from outside Wisconsin to come to and stay in the state. I underscore the need for external recruitment because while there is a great deal of very good workforce development being done here in Wisconsin, it has proved insufficient to address the root causes of the problem. The shortages are the result of decades of declining birth rates and the resulting aging of our workforce. Neither of these structural challenges lend themselves to employer and community needs for more workers and people now. The third major structural cause of Wisconsin's workforce and population shortages has been and remains low to negative net in-migration to the state. By way of example, in 2021, more than 1 million people in the U.S. moved from one state to another. Nearly half of those people relocated to one of 3 states. Another third moved to only 6 states. And Wisconsin, with more than 60,000 high-demand jobs going unfilled, welcomed only 3,370 people, roughly 1/3 of 1%. All of which we believe makes it very clear that Wisconsin must improve its ability to recruit and retain the numbers of workers and people it needs. It is in this context that elected officials, business and community leaders, providers, consumers, and experts have reached the conclusion that enhancing Wisconsin communities' ability to offer access to high-quality early childhood care and education will improve their ability to recruit and retain the workers and people they need. Also central to the context of the moment is the fact that the wise investment of local government ARPA funds can play an important role in improving access to high-quality care and education. And all of that makes building sustainable economies critical to our work today. More specifically, since the ARPA funds represent one-time money, the question of how we transition those funds effectively and appropriately into investments that will support our communities as we go forward has got to be central to the discussion. The first step in that process involves identifying a value equation. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen suggested earlier this year a need for a broader vision of potential supply-side contributors to increased economic growth, and specifically referenced labor supply and human capital as possibilities. That said, the identification of a value-added equation still involves identifying ways to increase revenues and/or decrease costs. And those working on and in early care and education have researched and identified a number of encouraging possibilities. The second task in developing sustainable economic investments involves testing and measuring the avenues of opportunity you've identified in your own market and being sensitive to the scalability of the plans you are considering. On the scalability issue, I would encourage you to read a new book by the University of Chicago economist John A. List called The Voltage Effect. With that data and information in hand, we must determine the dollar worth of the value findings over time. So, for example, we need to project the new and saved public revenues and private sector training and retention savings and profits over time against the cost of the envisioned investment to determine whether or not the possibility of a positive cash flow exists or not. If we can identify a positive cash flow for the investment, we must then develop an investment product that captures the potential revenues generated by the value identified. This is not a new concept. It's what people do when they talk about tax incentives, think about bonding, and creating IPOs. And it's something that Competitive Wisconsin has been recommending as a way of energizing Wisconsin's workforce recruitment and retention efforts. By way of example, here's a quick overview we provided for Synergy's Central Wisconsin Government Days conference in March of 2021. The first of those challenges is that our employers can't sustain and grow their businesses because we cannot find the workers we need. The second challenge is that we do not have the young people we need to sustain future growth. And the third is that workforce shortages are eroding the ability of our communities to provide the services and quality of life the new workers we must attract are seeking. Others facing similar challenges have responded creatively and aggressively. Some, like Ohio, are attracting and retaining workers with homeownership cash incentives. Others, like Tennessee, offer tuition-free education, and still others, like Vermont, offer cash grants to those willing to relocate. Competitive Wisconsin has identified a strategy that will enable Wisconsin to establish an advantage in each of these areas without raising taxes. More specifically, CWI proposes that rather than offering one or even two special programs, Wisconsin employers lead the way by letting the talent they want customize a package of incentives that works best for them. Wisconsin should also secure long-term stability for workforce investments such as incentives by securing the investments with contracts requiring years of employment in the state and by funding the incentive packages with a combination of public and private revenues generated by the job being filled. In addition, Wisconsin should utilize the recognized energy and power of its communities and regions by encouraging more robust local and regional efforts to grow and by recognizing the expertise and ability of local and regional development networks. Wisconsin must also begin the task of rebuilding its workforce pipelines, and to that end, should recruit and incentivize Midwestern high school graduates seeking education or training in high-demand job fields to attend and graduate from Wisconsin's universities and colleges. The premise is straightforward.
Unfilled jobs do not produce either income or taxes. When people fill jobs, they produce both and also generate additional public and private indirect and induced growth in taxes and income. If the public and private revenues generated by filling a particular job exceed the revenues needed to fund the investment in securing the right worker to fill that job, it is an investment worth considering. And by way of a specific example, we worked with Deloitte to determine how much new revenues a specific job opening might generate. Here you see one of three that we looked at. An associate degree nurse, Deloitte calculated, would generate nearly $9,000 in new public revenues and more than $30,000 in new private revenues each year. A single nurse would over a 5-year period of time then generate more than $200,000 in new revenues. Based on those numbers, funding the $20,000 incentive package for that nurse would yield a 5-year net of $180,000. And if we could fill all of the 2,000 plus growth and exit-driven nurse openings listed around the state of Wisconsin in these days, the net would be more than $390 million.
Of $392 million. Maybe we're wrong, but we're not that wrong, okay? That's a big number, and that's one out of 50 essential jobs, representing some 62,000 job openings in the state of Wisconsin. What I'm saying to you is we believe this is possible, and what we need to do is begin to help people understand how to pay for what you want to get done. What Nathan said is correct. I think we have a pretty good sense of what we need to be doing. What we have not addressed is how we pay for it, okay? And that's where we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Comments. One of the things that Jim is indicating is if we buy the model that by filling jobs we generate revenue to the tune of $340 million, maybe more, maybe slightly less, that those are dollars that can be invested to position our state for success. And one of those investments, of course, would be an investment in childcare, whether it's increased wages, whether it's assisting our current facilities, whatever it might be. Deloitte has done a lot of work in looking at our state from every different angle. What insights can you give us about where we might go next and how we position our state for success?
I think Jim did a great job of outlining the investment opportunity to try to bring more workers into the state. I might just build on his comments by taking a step back and reflecting on this moment in time where we find ourselves with the fluidity of capital and the fluidity of human capital. So capital making decisions about where companies are going to invest in the United States, which states and which locations to choose. A massive amount of those kinds of project decisions are happening. And then the associated decisions that individuals are making about where to live. In these COVID times, with more and more people finding themselves untethered to a specific location, they're moving with their feet. And just from a broader economic perspective, we are really witnessing a massive amount of movement around the country of people choosing to decide where to live and making those choices based on a host of different factors. Those could be tax factors, those could be quality of life factors, and early childhood programs play a role in that. I really believe that. When Jim reflected on where Wisconsin sits in terms of being able to attract people, it's really at best it's middle of the pack, depending on the numbers that you looked at. The numbers I pulled suggested that on a per capita basis, Wisconsin is 31 out of 50 in terms of attracting people. A slight net positive number of people choosing to move into the state, but not the highest on a per capita basis in the upper Midwest. That's Iowa. Believe it or not, Iowa is attracting more people to net migration, more people over the last 12 months to move into Iowa than Wisconsin is. If I had to vote with my feet, I would be choosing Wisconsin, by the way, not Iowa. But I really believe that quality of life factors, early childhood education that are going to be important to a lot of people that are choosing on where to live, that plays into it. I think also when we think about helping companies make decisions about where to deploy, we are always looking at quality of life factors. And those quality of life factors, right at the top of that is the quality of the educational system. People care about that, and relocating executives care very much about that, and that's part of the analysis. Wisconsin tends to score fairly well when it comes to education, but I think that when we're talking about specifically early childhood education, we have to take a look at how other states are doing, and what other states are doing, and who's paying these early childhood educators well, which states are promoting early childhood programs, which states have that kind of money to invest. I think that the calculus that Jim outlined, when we look at the value of bringing in those three examples, it was an ADN nurse, a welder, or a network engineer. The value of bringing those individuals into the state over the long period of time, the direct, indirect, and induced impact of those jobs, it's massive. It's a huge no-brainer investment to try to lure people to make their decision to come into the state and fill these unfilled jobs. It's a no-brainer in terms of increased tax revenue, increased economic activity, and I think that then gives the state more money to invest. And this can be a virtuous cycle of bringing people in, capitalizing on those additional revenues, and investing in things like early childhood education in order to continue to drive more business and personal relocation into the state.
Darren, before we move on to Dean Brooks, you seem to be implying that the folks in this room, we feel we have a challenge in our state, which is the availability of affordable child care, and the real issue behind that is one of the significant issues is the pay level of our providers. We feel that. Others outside this room might say, well, it's a market issue. The greater the demand, eventually wages will go up because that's the way the market works. But you seem to be implying that there's a different way to look at it, which is if we care about a vibrant economy with the number one fuel for private sector profit being smart talent, human beings, that we can attract more of those people if we provide that benefit of affordable childcare. And in order to do that, we might look at it if we're pro the economy or pro capital markets. We actually might want to engage in making childcare a very attractive part of moving to this state. Do I have it right?
In my view, yes. I think investments in education are different than investments in other areas, because education, the quality of the education system influences where people choose to live, and it influences where companies choose to operate. So it's a great multiplier effect. It's not the same as investing in other aspects necessarily. And I'm not going to take away the importance of other parts of the state budget. No doubt there are roads and bridges that are in need of constant repair. There are new buildings that need to be built. There are other departments and other salaries that need to be maintained. The kinds of things that public sector is responsible for, they're all important. But the great thing about investing in education is the multiplier effect that you get in that it influences how people choose to interact with the state. It influences how companies choose to invest in the state.
Professor Brooks, you have one foot in business theory and another foot in measurement and practicality. How does the issue of childcare how do you view the challenge we're facing?
So just sort of dovetailing with what you just asked about, I think sometimes economists think of that as a market failure, or maybe it's probably more accurately described as an incomplete market. So I want to describe something really quickly for you. So when we think about making an investment, so let's say we're thinking about buying a washer for our house, why are we willing to make that private investment? Because the alternative is we wash our clothes in the sink and we hang it to dry out, and then that takes a lot of time to do, and it's this investing in this capital makes our life much better, right? but the investment is a private investment and the return is entirely private. And as sort of Darren started to describe, and has been discussed by Jim as well, there are some aspects that are public returns to these types of investments that we can think about. But there's also a lot of private returns. And so, if you think about, I'm also in this from a demand side. I've got a 4.5-year-old, almost 5-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And so I think about like them. I should just tell them, you should be investing in your own education and paying for it privately because eventually you're going to get a job and earn lots of money. So why don't you start paying for it now? Of course, that's absurd, right? But an economist thinks like this, by the way. So we think this is an incomplete market, right? They can't access financing to finance their education. So this is what traditionally the public has done, is to do this. I think where this all becomes sort of challenging is when the stuff we're talking about today, in particular, there are, Dennis talked about high returns to early child care. I think there are high returns to quality child care and for some kids. And that's where it starts to get complicated. Like, how do you monetize that? It's not just about a private return. There are private and social returns. And we have to think about that. Interesting, he talked about Perry Preschool and some of the other ones. Some of the recent evidence is that the high fiscal returns to those quality programs is the massive reduction in incarceration rates later in life, right? So think about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce people in jail 20 years from now if we have good quality early child care. So that means we're going to spend less on jails. So what we really need to do is take money out of the state government incarceration system and put it in early child care, right? And that's just that's the politics of that transition are really difficult, right? It's not just about taking tax revenues and redirecting them. There's all of the political economy of that goes on. So I think those are sort of the challenges that we face. The things that Jim sort of pointed out are sort of beyond the traditional aspects of returns to early child care. They're sort of current returns to employers, right? Again, so that's a return to a private employer that they're gaining. There's some returns also in terms of potential tax revenue. And I hear about those things, and I think that there's a good argument for that. But honestly, I think about that, it just reminds me, it's like a new take on chasing smokestacks, right? So it's a beggar thy neighbor policy. We want to steal some people from Minnesota to come locate here because of our good child care. I think we should have good child care, right? But I feel like the argument to try to attract people here is a potentially challenging one. Again, it gets into the political economy of these things. But you're absolutely right. We need to think about sort of the returns, who's getting the returns, and therefore trying to sort of monetize that investment based upon the future returns. I'd just say a couple of things about the challenges with why the market is in a bit of a failure, or why they're sort of incomplete markets as well. Regulation. So you heard a plea by Jody that the regulatory burden is high. I think every business says that, by the way. It's a very conservative argument. And I agree, there's lots of ways we could improve efficiencies, and we absolutely should do that. One of the regulatory burdens often pointed to is the ratio, right? The ratio of kids. But you start to think about that, and I started to think about it. It's a 4-to-1 for a baby. And I'm like, yeah, we should run that up to 8-to-1. And then you start to think they're all looking at me like, you idiot. You're right, I am an idiot. But so this is those ratios are also sort of are like a signal of quality too. So again, we go back to, you could reduce those ratios, but then you would also move from high quality to low quality. And we know low quality daycare is when I stay home with the kids, it's terrible, right? It's not good for the kids. It's not going to reduce their incarceration rate later in life. The other concerns that with some of these things that we've seen, so there's very high insurance costs that they face. And I think one of the interesting things we've heard here is sort of a little bit of a discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, about where these places are located. Are we using current capital, or are we using other capital? I know why the schools want to do it. They have capacity, right? So they have capacity as well. But I also hear the sort of daycare providers saying, we too have some physical capacity. I think one of the things you find is that the reason daycare costs are high oftentimes is because of high rent. So the choice of location, where parents want to drop their kids off, right? So sometimes that ends up being at very high cost places. And so that should be a consideration in this as well. Anyhow, I'll leave it there.
So, Ann, before we move on to you, Professor, So if we take dollars from incarceration, let's generally call it that, and invest it in early childhood education and care, it requires us to buy into the premise that we are going to see that benefit in less negative activity in society. Mm-hmm. Do we have, the business mind, of course, would say, well, where's the measurement? Show me that. It takes a bit of a leap of faith. Now, all of us in this room, intuitively, that makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. Does the availability of ARPA funds allow us to have a little less incomplete market and make it easier for us to buy into that?
Yeah, arguably, it might be a short-term bridge to that, or at least a bridge to provide you the capacity to negotiate the political economy problems we have of moving to a different system.
Okay, Ann, from the on-the-ground perspective, how are these challenges affecting real life, real small business?
Saying in working with small business, I would come at this from a couple different directions than maybe just the traditional. I can kind of relate to the child care providers who are themselves oftentimes small businesses. I also can relate to we use the term small business, and that term kind of means a lot of things to different people. The definition actually can cover fairly large businesses, but I'm going to focus my attention a little bit more on what I call the micro small business. We'll sort of define that as 20 or fewer employees. And in those situations, most of those employers, while they would like to do a lot for their workers, frankly don't have the capacity in most cases to be able to do that. And so to provide that assistance becomes critical. It also is really important, I think, to involve that sector in the discussion, because those are the individuals that are trying to fill those positions. They are relating very closely to what some of the child care providers and others have spoken about. It's hard to find the workers. It's hard to do things. And we think of this problem as a problem, it's the people sitting on the sidelines or only doing part-time jobs. Small businesses right now are operating on limited schedules. Their operational efficiencies are not very effective right now because they can't find staff. If they can't find the staff to be able to work their operations in an efficient manner, that ends up affecting productivity. It ends up affecting just what they're able to put back into the community. Okay, so we really have to look at it broader. The other thing, and I'll just make this observation, I kind of see 5 core groups: the employer or businesses, the employee, which we kind of never really talk about. We kind of mention them as a parent, but we don't really focus. I'm going to come back to that. Obviously, the public and the public benefit of doing certain things, the child care provider, the one that's actually going to provide that quality care, and then, of course, the child. And we don't oftentimes really hear a lot about the child either in discussing this problem. But I'm going to emphasize for a moment the worker. The worker has a life cycle of work. Different things are important to that worker at different times. And in really to address not only child care but a lot of other things, you need to understand that. If you're going to attract somebody, probably that profile can't just focus on child care. Because some of those workers that you're initially attracting don't have children. They're not coming here for that. They have other things that are important to them. So I would sort of say that you need to look at, you have a 5-year strategy, and I realize that's just an example, but you need, kind of a little bit more of a life cycle of a worker. So you can motivate more people to be attracted to come to our community, and then at the same time, as they go through that life cycle, be able to support them. And it's really important that we actually ask workers why they have or don't have participation at certain times in their life. Because again, if you don't understand that, you're kind of building it with the idea that if we build it, they will come, but they might not come. You really have to understand that. On the worker side, I think one of the things that it's really hard at the point in time in your life when you have young children to really, first of all, it's very busy, right? And so you don't really have a lot that you're thinking about. But I can come at this from a parent perspective as well. I have 3 children. My husband was activated for about 7 to 8 years in about a 10 to 11 year period, starting when our twin daughters were 1. So I've lived the life of a single parent because he was activated out of our area, so he wasn't home. So I gave me a lot of perspective on things. But I also realized at that time, not to the degree I do now, but at that time, sort of what Julie was talking about. There are things our children gain from having access to others that are professionals and able to bring things that no matter how good we want to be as parents, we don't have. I could do it a day or two. They do it every day. My children were in childcare, and I came to value that. Now one's graduated from college, the other 2 are in college, and I appreciate their perspective of things and how they value things and what they've participated in part by what they got exposed to because they were in early childhood education. So I think one of the important things we need to add on the return of the investment piece is to the worker. We need to do more to educate workers about the long-term advantages that also come from having children participate in this, not just because we want the worker, but because it's good for them professionally and personally. It builds their family life, and it actually, and in my life I can speak to this, when I actually was home with my children, I could give a lot of energy there. It allows you to kind of conquer the whole situation. But there are a lot of people that don't get exposed to that. They might later in life say, geez, I wish I had done that, right? That's too late. We have to do more to educate the workers about some of those advantages. So the other thing I'd like to just kind of mention has to do with the continuity of care. So today we're focused on early child care and education. But it's not like when your children go to kindergarten or first grade or whatever it might be, all of a sudden your child care needs are done, right? Or someone else is going to solve them. Children will need, and some will argue that your children might need more care when they're or high school students or middle school students than when they're younger, okay, in different ways. So we really need to look at the continuity of care because you can solve it at the early age, but if you're not paying also attention to what the follow-on care is, you will have then a disruption of your workforce because then they have to be involved that way. So that becomes an important part. Another thing I'll just mention, and there have been some individuals that have mentioned different things, and I'm not here to promote that something's done a certain way or not a certain way, but I'm just going to call it the whack-a-mole situation, okay? We knock down one thing only to have some new problem occur somewhere else. So one of the big issues with, and this is true in all small business, by the way, particularly in micro business, the benefit issue, okay? So I'm just going to, while we want benefits to be provided, we also, one of the things that has come along and has been for many small businesses, especially in their years as they're growing their businesses, is the ability to use things like the Affordable Care Act and things like that to be able to provide solutions. And I've had instances where employers who all want to provide benefits but only can pay so much to their workers, the workers would expend more money to be offered health care benefits at work than not. So I just point that out, that sometimes our strategies, well intended, sometimes can work against the group that we're really trying to benefit. So when we look at the solutions and something like that, which is an important factor in trying to provide the capability to that worker, and also do something that the employer can do, maybe the employer providing something more in terms of the child care might be more valuable at certain times to that worker, and depending upon the worker's situation, than other things. So benefits shouldn't be just looked at in one way. I just encourage that because there are strategies that actually are gains for the worker and for the employer and make benefits generally just more affordable from that standpoint. And then finally, I'll just mention, as I mentioned earlier, child care providers are small businesses, okay? So many of the things you're experiencing, I hate to acknowledge it, but you're in the same boat of many other people, right? That doesn't make you feel any better, but it's true. There are things that are out there, and besides ARPA, okay, ARPA is being disseminated a lot of different ways, and we're talking a lot of them here. But there are many of child care providers are women-owned businesses. They tend to be a little bit more disproportionately owned that way. There are going to be some benefits that are going to become available, and I would just encourage, make inquiry about those because they're about $86 million actually have been allocated to help businesses that are owned by diverse individuals. And that will be both some support in terms of grants and potentially forgivable loans. So when we're trying to strengthen things, let's try to use all the different resources that might exist. So I'll kind of turn off for that.
In listening to the four of you, it strikes me that we may be on the edge of a possible solution or addressing this issue in this way. I suspect we would all agree that we want, as a state, more people making more money, engaged in more commerce. We want that, a more vibrant economy. In order to get that, we need people in the workforce. One of the impediments to getting people in the workforce is available, affordable childcare. One of the impediments to that affordable, available childcare are the properly paid, compensated, quality individuals to provide that childcare. We have a temporary solution of ARPA, which might create, as the professor indicated, some kind of a bridge. A more permanent solution then, sustainable solution, is, Jim Wood, your model, which allows us to capture future benefit by having people employed in the workforce. In addition to all of that, we have this added benefit of if we care for these young people at a young age, they don't grow up to be not so nice people, as the professor alluded to. So we added benefit. If that's the case, why can we not simply do this? What's in the way? What's the problem? What's the mountain that we have to move?
I think the answer is we can do it. We can't do it in the next 6 months. I understand the frustration. We have ARPA money, yet it's created a change in the circumstances. If we are wise about what we do with the ARPA money, I think you create opportunities. And as those of you who know me, I think the single most important thing about this moment in time, whether it's early care or it's housing or it's broadband or whatever, is to take a look at that 3 to 5 year period that's coming next. So I think we can get it done, but it's a 3 to 5 year process, and it's an interrelated process because you're talking about strengthening community capacity to attract a specific targeted set of audiences to come here and become your future. That's essentially what we're talking about here, okay? And the question is, how do we do that? It is a shift from where you have been for the last year when everybody's saying to you, well, what the hell's wrong with it? Why isn't it working? What's going on? You have done a superb job of defining what's not working and why it's not working. What we have not done is talk about the next step, which is, okay, if we want to do that, how are we going to pay for it? Okay? In this group of people at this panel, and these are all wonderful people that I'm delighted they're here, we have some differences of opinion about how we get there. Just beginning to have that conversation is progress, okay? The private sector has to get more engaged with this issue. I think they're ready to do that. They're looking for ways to do that. That's progress, okay? So that's where I think the answer to your question, Mark, is we can do it. But we're going to have to do it together, and it will not happen if we all leave this room and everybody goes back to your caves and we look out the next morning and say, well, they didn't fix it yet, okay? It's going to take more than that.
Those loosely connected statements that I made, Ann, Professor, Darren, any response? I mean, what mountain is in the way that needs to be maneuvered?
Well, I'll make one comment. I think that we need to look at the 3 to 5 years because that's where the immediate dollars are. But I would suggest you need to then look at that next wave. And as I said earlier, you really have to look at attracting, because otherwise it's just sort of a moment and it doesn't create the sustainability piece. So if in fact the numbers are you invest $20,000, you'll get $200,000, that will continue to occur. And so once proven out, then the argument would be we need to continuously make that available, not just for child care, but for other things. You've got other ways that at different stages, whatever a person's stage is, that they can take advantage in, whatever their personal circumstance, so that we become really a magnet for individuals to come here. I also would like to just, so TJ emphasizes the incarceration piece, which I think is, you can get people's attention because it's a pretty expensive piece, which is good. But I'd like to emphasize that if we have more children having more access to quality care, we're also going to have higher incomes in the long run. And there's numbers you can run on that the future of those families in our state will be well positioned to be outside what is typically considered poverty, and they'll have higher educations, and they will be a driver for many years to come, what we have. So I tend to look at the half full. I don't know, TJ, what?
Yeah, so I think, I think some of the current research is, so this is, as an economist who really likes to focus on a really specific question, the challenge when talking sort of broadly like this is, maybe I get misunderstood sometimes. So the research that focuses just on the things like preschool and that specific pre-K, very high quality, small group, early child care, is the research where initially showed academic benefits. It turns out the sort of reevaluation of that suggests those benefits die out. But it's not because they leave early child care and don't get any more care or education. They just go into another system, and it turns out that early intervention dies out a little bit. So this is why I emphasize the thing that doesn't die out, which is the incarceration. And because it's a large dollar amount. That's what sticks. But again, you're absolutely right, though, that like all education, absolutely all the education that we sort of, human capital accumulation we get, the return on investment is enormous. It's why, we tell people to get an education, right? So to society, it's an enormous benefit. To them personally, privately, it's an enormous benefit. So let me be clear about that. I think the big thing that we're missing here is really just an acknowledgement that we need, even if those educational benefits that happen really early, the academic benefits die out, there's lots of good evidence that there's still health benefits that exist and last longer. The incarceration benefits last longer. And we just need an acknowledgement that there's this incomplete market, failure, whatever you want to call it, and we need public funding for it. Like, that's what's going to close the gap. Jim's got this clever way of sort of making an argument for why we need to do this. At the end of the day, it's public funding, right? And you couch it under the idea that we get a return to this as the public, but at the end of the day, it's tax revenue that's trying to sort of improve our infrastructure. But to make it simple, just pay for daycare early on, and then you solve your problem. You clap, though, but that's a huge political problem, right? I have kids, I have friends that didn't have kids, I used to not have kids, and I would have argued vociferously against the big public subsidy for it. So, you have a big political problem to achieve that. Jim's has an idea for how to do that, and I think it's,
Well, and again, I think it's the magic of these moments, folks, okay? We really are at a different time in this country and in this state and in this region. And TJ and I don't disagree as much as he thinks we do sometimes, but here's what I will tell you. You can't, the premise here, the fundamental premise is that over the last 50 years, the alignment between our tax system in terms of how we fund things has become misaligned, all right? How do you wind up with more student debt than credit card debt in the United States of America? And the answer to that is because the business model was being used for higher education. At the time, we were advocating everybody had to get a higher education degree in order to be employable, okay? Drove up the cost of education, but more people had to get into it, so we put more money in through Pell Grants, changed it, all these bits and stories. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but the question is, if your business plan is, I need my money up front, okay, we need to take a look at that. If all of the value is there, we have numbers of the difference you earn over a lifetime. So if you earn over a lifetime with a 4-year degree $1.6 million more than a high school graduate, okay, and the total cost of doing paid child care plus K-12 plus some sort of advanced degree is somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, well, there's $1 million out there over the course of a 45-year-old period of time. We haven't figured out how you make that bonding work in terms of the time, use of money, or whatever, but it says, well, wouldn't you sit down and talk about that, okay? You know, you think about, you know, I'm a firm believer that part of the way you ought to be financing K-12 is that if the K-12 system does a good job and they go to work for somebody in the community, the company ought to recognize that at some point in time. So if they're still working for you 2 years later, maybe you give $500 to the high school they graduated from. Or if they come to the college and you don't have to do, you know, remedial training and education, there's a dollar value to that. I like that because that's attached to the actual activity. It's attached to the individual, the actual activity, and the institution that's producing, quote, that product. Okay? So I'm not saying I got it all answered, but I'm saying this is the conversation that I think is worthwhile when you begin to ask about paying for it. Finally, to TJ's point about it, it's tax dollars. The program for using, for the one that we're talking about, workforce investment, says that the nurse, for example, is generating about $2,000 a year in state taxes, direct state taxes. So for 5 years, the state agrees that they will give that as that money comes through the door, they will put it into the fund for the $20,000 for that particular nurse hire. Okay? The private sector matches that, or the employer matches that. That's how you get, so it's 10 and 10, you get to 20. Okay? Now, over and above that, the community's benefiting, the state's benefiting, they're collecting other kinds of taxes. So it's a net gain for them, even in that first 5 years. But if you do this right, obviously, and everybody moves to La Crosse where nobody wants to leave, okay, then you're going to keep collecting that tax money. Okay? So from an investment point of view, as opposed to defining it as public, yes, it's tax dollars, but it's tax dollars they don't have. So I'm creating a tax dollar. I'm producing a product. That's the price tag.
Darren, Deloitte's full of a lot of smart people. So what do you see as the impediment to us solving this market / compensation for quality care, child care education in our state?
Look, I think like a lot of things, it's about political will and building on what the panel has said. I'm a firm believer in showing people data and showing them the facts. It sounds like there may be money available, and it may be a question of how do we best spend this. So showing legislators and decision makers how are other states moving the needle, what programs seem to work. Is $1 or $1,000 or $1 billion spent on childhood education tuition or childhood education educator salaries or facilities or attracting more early childhood educators to the state, or whatever it is? Show them the data on what works. And I think this is about return on investment. And I believe legislators can be moved by those kinds of facts and create some political will to get something done.
Ladies and gentlemen, Darren Bulow, Jim Wood, Professor Brooks, and Ann Halawaka, thank you very much for being on the panel. Please join me in thanking our panel.